My name is Margaret, and I'm 65 years old. They say that when a woman has lived more than half her life, when she's seen enough ups and downs, nothing can make her tremble anymore. But I was trembling. I trembled on the very day my world fell apart, the day we buried the man who had been by my side for 40 years. The funeral took place on a bleak morning. The late autumn wind cut sharply through the brittle trees of the small cemetery at the edge of town. I wore my old black dress, the only one I kept for such occasions, its stiff collar feeling like a noose around my throat. I clenched my shaking hands, trying to hold back the tears, but failed. Everything around me blurred, the drops swept away by the cold wind before they could even fall. Before me was a closed wooden coffin. Inside lay the man I loved most, my life partner, the father of my children, Ernest. His name had never hurt so much. I used to call him so many things. Ernie, when I was feeling playful, Mr. Hayes during our pretend arguments, or simply Honey when dinner was on the table. Now, every name felt meaningless. Around me, the sound of prayers and condolences droned on, as hollow as the wind sweeping past my ears. But what chilled me to the bone wasn't the wind. It was the look in the eyes of my own two sons. Charles and Henry stood side by side, dressed in impeccable suits, their faces so somber they were unreadable. I looked into their eyes and saw only emptiness. There were no sincere tears, no comforting squeeze of the hand. My grief felt like a performance they were attending out of obligation. I told myself, maybe they're just too overwhelmed with grief to show it. But deep down, a whisper insisted, no, something is wrong. As the priest finished his final prayer, people began to toss the first handfuls of dirt onto the coffin. The dry thud of soil hitting wood echoed in my chest like a hammer. Each shovelful felt like it was tearing my heart apart all over again. I buckled at the knees, and Doris, my dear neighbor, had to catch me to keep me from collapsing right there at the graveside. Just then, my small purse vibrated. My phone. I flinched, shocked that anyone would call me in the midst of this nightmare. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. An unknown number. Instinct told me to ignore it, but an invisible force made me open the message. Just 3 words appeared. I'm still alive. My entire body froze. I read it again and again, my heart pounding erratically. I blinked, wondering if I was seeing things. But the words remained, sharp as a knife's edge. That's not me in the coffin. Don't trust our sons. I dropped the phone onto the grass. Doris bent to pick it up, but I snatched it back, hiding it in my palm. It's nothing, I stammered, forcing a weak smile. But a cold sweat had broken out on the back of my neck. I no longer heard the priest's words or saw them sealing the grave. My mind was consumed by the message on the screen. I'm still alive. Don't trust our sons. My head spun. If Ernest was alive, then who was in that coffin? A stranger, a cruel joke, or was someone trying to manipulate me? I glanced at my sons. Charles stood with one hand on a shovel, repeatedly checking his watch as if impatient for the ceremony to end. Henry was discreetly texting on his phone, though his lips were pressed together in a solemn performance. In that moment, a sharp pain pierced my heart. Were these the same children I had once held in my arms, the ones I had raised with all my heart? I tried to stay calm, to hide the storm raging inside me. I took Doris's hand and whispered, I want to go home. She nodded sympathetically and helped me leave the cemetery while others lingered. In the car on the way home, I opened the message again, still just those 2 short lines, nothing more, my fingers trembling. I typed a reply, Who is this? As I sent it, my heart tightened. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. No response. I rested my head against the cool car window, tears streaming down my face. 1,000 theories raced through my mind. Was Ernest really not dead? Or was this just some cruel person's idea of a joke? But a tiny, desperate part of my heart clung to that fragile sliver of hope. That night, in a house empty of his familiar laughter, I sat at the small wooden table where Ernest used to drink his morning coffee. I placed the phone in front of me, staring at the dark screen, waiting for another sign. Nothing. Only the ticking of the wall clock and the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the door. But I knew. From the moment I received that message, my life had taken a sharp turn. I couldn't just bury everything along with that wooden coffin. I had to find out. I had to know the truth. And I had a feeling that the truth wouldn't just be about Ernest's death, but also about the 2 sons I had once trusted completely. I closed my eyes, and memories flooded back like an old film reel, vivid and clear. I remember being just a young girl with hair down to my waist, working at the small general store in town. I met him on a sweltering afternoon when the store's cooling unit broke down, and Ernest, the quiet, reserved mechanic, was called in to fix it. He walked in wearing a light blue shirt smudged with grease, sleeves rolled up, with beads of sweat on his forehead. I remember that moment perfectly. He gave a small, shy smile and said in his deep voice, "This is an easy fix. The fan belt just slipped. It wasn't romantic like in the movies. No flowers, no music, no fancy declarations of love. But there was something in his eyes that made me feel safe. Something genuine. That day, I found myself wishing the cooler would break a few more times, just for an excuse to see him a little longer. We started seeing each other through a series of accidents. He'd stop by the store to buy a few odds and ends, and I'd pretend to be busy but would always look up when the bell on the door chimed. Sometimes he'd use the excuse of bringing me cookies his mother had made. I still remember the scratched tin box, filled with slightly burnt, but the sweetest cookies I'd ever tasted. Gradually, the excuses turned into real dates. We'd sit by the river, talking about simple things, his love for fixing machines, my love for cheap paperback novels. He told me about his dream of opening his own workshop, and I dreamed of a small house with a white picket fence and a flower garden out front. Neither of us dreamed of getting rich or famous. We just dreamed of a quiet life together. I remember our wedding day. A simple ceremony in a wooden church, a wedding dress borrowed from my cousin, and a bouquet of daisies I'd hastily picked from the backyard. There was no band, no champagne, just a few dozen close friends and family singing hymns, but I believed it was the most beautiful day of my life, because I was holding Ernest's hand, convinced that no matter how poor we were, as long as I had him, everything would be okay. The first few years of our marriage were a struggle. Ernest opened a small workshop with just a wooden workbench, a few old tools, and a hand-painted sign that hung crookedly by the door, Hayes Repairs. I worked part-time at the library, both to earn money and to sneak read the new books. We had nothing but faith and patience. On cold winter nights when the roof leaked, we'd huddle together under a thin blanket, giggling as the water dripped into a tin bucket beside our bed. When Charles was born, I felt like I had everything. Ernest held our son in his rough, trembling hands, repeating over and over, "He looks just like you." 2 years later, Henry arrived with his father's bright blue eyes. Our tiny house was suddenly filled with the sounds of crying, laughter, and 1,000 little worries. I still remember Ernest sitting in his wooden chair, holding the boys, softly humming old folk songs he'd learned from his mother. I would watch, my heart overflowing with love, thinking how truly lucky I was. Our dinners were humble, bean stew and stale bread, but they were filled with the sounds of our children playing and the sparkle in my husband's eyes. I used to believe that was the purest form of happiness, but as the years went by, the children grew up, and the world outside changed. They wanted more than what we could give them. Ernest remained loyal to his small workshop, proud of his honest work. I was content with our old house and my flower garden. But Charles and Henry started talking about things we didn't understand: stocks, investments, big houses in the city. I remember one family dinner. Charles slammed his phone on the table and said, "Can you two really live like this forever? People are buying new houses, new cars, and you're still stuck here." Ernest just smiled gently. "We don't need much. Seeing you boys succeed is enough for us." But Henry scoffed. "You have to think bigger. You have to make your money work for you, not just settle." I sat there in silence, my heart tightening. I looked at my two sons, the boys I once held in my arms, and they felt like strangers, as if they no longer belonged to my world. I told myself, they'll understand eventually. When they're truly grown, they'll learn to appreciate it. But the distance between us grew, like a silent crack in a wall that, by the time you notice, has become an unbridgeable chasm. In my memory, Ernest always tried to hold us together. He patiently told old stories, invited the boys over for dinner, and made them wooden furniture. But their eyes no longer lit up with pride. Instead, they flickered with impatience, as if their father's words were a burden. I saw it. I felt it. But I didn't dare admit it. The family that was once my heaven was slowly slipping through my fingers. For a long time, I tried to convince myself that everything was normal, that these were just generational differences. But day by day, the little things became harder to ignore. I vividly remember one summer evening, Ernest had invited Charles and Henry over for dinner. I had made my chicken and mushroom stew, their favorite dish when they were kids. But when I served it, Charles just pushed his plate away with a sigh. "Mom, this is so greasy. People eat healthy now, low fat, low carb. Why don't you try making something new?" Henry just sat there, typing on his phone, not even bothering to look up. Ernest forced a smile and tried to change the subject. "Just eat, son. Your mother spent all afternoon cooking." But the air was so thick with tension, I felt like I was choking before I'd even taken a bite. They used to fight over the last piece of chicken until one of them cried. Now, they looked at the plate as if it were something obsolete, disconnected from any memory. Then there was the money talk. Charles started bringing up investments, about how we should reevaluate our assets. One day he came over, his voice deceptively sweet, but his eyes sharp and cold. "Mom, this house is worth a lot. If you sell it and move into a small apartment in the city, you'd have an easier life and money to live on. It's a waste to let all that value sit in this run-down old house." I was stunned. I turned to Ernest, who just frowned and said nothing. This house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was our entire youth, the place where our children learned to walk, where they fell and laughed. It was where Ernest had painstakingly planted the daisies in the backyard for me. And now, it was all dismissed as rundown. I stayed silent because I knew if I said anything, no one would understand. Henry was less direct, but he kept bringing up insurance. He'd ask Ernest if his policy was up to date. If he'd thought about securing my future, Ernest would laugh it off. "All I need is my health. What's more valuable than that?" But behind his back, I saw Henry scowl, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Those comments, which at first sounded like concern, began to feel like a steady, rhythmic tapping against my heart. I started to sense something hidden behind their words, a calculation I wasn't ready to name. Then, one day, Ernest came home from the workshop looking exhausted, his eyes clouded as if from sleepless nights. When I asked what was wrong, he just said, "Charles keeps pushing me. It's always about money. I'm not used to it." I took his hand and tried to reassure him. "He'll understand eventually. Children always want what's best for their parents." But as I said it, I didn't believe it myself. The distance between us and our sons grew wider. Conversations revolved only around assets, insurance, and the house. I could hardly remember the last time they asked about family, or even a simple, "How are you?" Ernest remained patient. He still called them on weekends, still sent them pictures of the flower garden. But I saw a sadness in his eyes that he never spoke of, as if he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. One evening, I overheard a conversation between the two of them on the porch. Charles was whispering urgently, "If the old man would just sign, this would all be over. If not, we'll have to find another way." Henry replied in a cold tone, "Leave it to me. Just make sure Mom doesn't get suspicious." My heart dropped. I wanted to storm out and demand an explanation, but my feet felt glued to the floor. I stood behind the curtain, trembling. When I walked into the room, they went silent, pretending to talk about baseball. I forced a smile, but a storm was raging inside me. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. I saw Henry secretly going through papers in Ernest's office. I saw Charles show up at the workshop, not to visit, but to look through the ledgers. I saw them hang up the phone abruptly whenever I walked into the room. I started memorizing every detail, every expression. I asked myself, was I being paranoid, or was it a mother's instinct? One late night, Ernest was sitting at the kitchen table, holding a cold cup of coffee. He spoke softly, his voice strained. "I'm worried. Maggie, I feel like they're not our sons anymore. Their eyes, they're different." I sat down next to him and wrapped my arms around his trembling shoulders. I didn't know how to comfort him other than to say, "We still have each other." But in my heart, a vague fear had already taken root. These signs piled up, small but sharp. A word, a look, an odd gesture. They all wove together into a dark web that was closing in around me, and with each passing day, I became more certain that what I was feeling was not a delusion. I started to act in silence. No one knew, not even Doris. I was afraid that one wrong word would get back to the very people I was beginning to distrust. One morning, I sat in Ernest's small office. The scent of old wood and machine oil still lingered, as if his presence had never left. On his desk, files and papers were scattered about. I opened each drawer with trembling hands. In the third one, under a stack of old ledgers, I found an insurance policy folder. The numbers hit me like a punch. The value of Ernest's life insurance policy had been increased several times over, and the change was made just a few months before he died. I read the date again and again. Then my eyes landed on the signature at the bottom. It was Ernest's handwriting, but it looked strange, forced, as if signed under duress. I had lived with him my whole life, watched him write every Christmas card, every little note. I knew the difference. My body went numb. Who had convinced him to do this? And why? I kept digging. Bank statements were clipped behind the policy. My eyes froze on a series of strange withdrawals. Large sums of money had been taken out, but Ernest had never mentioned it to me. I remembered every dollar he saved, every time he scolded me for buying something unnecessary. He wasn't a reckless spender. So where did that money go? I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling in my face, one step away from falling. But I couldn't stop. I had to know. The next day, I decided to go to the bank. I chose a quiet time, walking slowly to avoid drawing attention. The teller, a young woman with a polite smile, looked at me as I handed her the documents. I asked about the withdrawals. She typed for a moment, then hesitated. "Ma'am, these were all signed by Mr. Ernest Hayes. The transactions are valid." I looked at the screen, at a scanned copy of the signature. It was Ernest's name, but the handwriting was shaky, not his usual firm script. I tried to stay calm and gave a weak smile. "Thank you." As I turned to leave, I overheard her whisper to a colleague. His son was with him that day. I froze but didn't dare turn back. I walked straight out, my heart pounding in my chest. A son. So they were involved. I had no concrete proof, but the pieces were starting to fit together. That evening, I sat with Doris on the porch. My old friend looked at me, her eyes seeming to see straight through my worries. I had planned to stay silent, but then the words tumbled out. "Doris, do you think children always want what's best for their parents?" She placed her hand on mine, her touch heavy. "Not always, Maggie. Some only think of themselves. I've seen it before. You have to be careful." Her words landed in my heart like a stone. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny it any longer. After that day, I watched them even more closely. I noticed Charles would visit on certain days, carrying a thick binder of papers, and then lock himself in the office with Henry. I'd walk by and overhear snippets of their conversations. What if Mom finds out? Don't worry, she's old, she won't understand. I learned to be quiet. I memorized every detail, every date, every scrap of paper they left on the table. I was no longer the gentle mother who only knew how to cook and tend her garden. I had become a spy in my own home, searching for the truth in the shadows. Once, while pretending to clean the living room, I found a crumpled piece of paper under a sofa cushion, a draft of a contract to sell the house with Charles's name scribbled at the bottom. I held the paper, my fingers trembling. Were they really planning to take everything from me? I tucked the paper into my pocket, sat down, and took a deep breath. I knew I couldn't confront them directly. I had to find another way, quiet and certain. And in that moment, in the terrifying silence of the house, I heard a voice echo in my head, as clear as a whisper in my ear. "Don't trust our sons." On a bleak morning before the sun had fully risen over the old rooftops of town, I decided to go to the workshop. I told myself it was just a visit to remember him, but deep down, a powerful urge was pushing me. I needed to see the place where Ernest had fallen. The workshop was at the end of a dirt road, next to an abandoned junkyard. Normally, it was a place filled with the sounds of hammers, drills, and a crackling radio playing country music. But today, it was silent. The door was slightly ajar, and the wind whistling through the gap made a haunting, creaking sound. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell of machine oil was still there, but the familiar chaos was gone. I remembered how Ernest always left things in a mess, wrenches scattered on the workbench, bolts on the floor, a grease-stained jacket hanging loosely on a hook. But now, everything was too neat. The concrete floor was unusually clean, with no trace of an explosion. I stood there, a chill running down my spine. They said an accident happened here, but there was no debris, no scorch marks on the walls. It was as if someone had meticulously cleaned up to erase the evidence. I walked slowly along the wooden workbench. My fingers brushed across its smooth surface, touching the small scratches I knew Ernest had made during his late nights working. Suddenly, my eyes landed on an old leather-bound notebook tucked under a toolbox. I pulled it out and flipped through the pages. Ernest's familiar handwriting appeared, messy but firm. The last entry nearly made me collapse. "Charles wants me to increase the insurance. Henry brought some strange papers, said I just needed to sign. I don't trust it. Something isn't right. If anything happens, Maggie has to know. I trembled, tears welling up in my eyes. Those words were like a knife twisting in my gut. Ernest had sensed the danger. He had been suspicious. And he had left me one final message. I closed the notebook and held it tightly to my chest. The room seemed to spin around me. I sank onto the wooden stool where Ernest used to sit, picturing him hunched over, fixing some engine. I could almost hear his voice echoing, "Maggie, you have to be strong." A strange noise startled me. Footsteps outside the door, heavy and slow. I quickly shoved the notebook into my coat pocket. The door swung open, and Charles appeared. He looked at me, momentarily stunned, then forced a smile. "Mom, what are you doing here?" I tried to sound calm. "I just wanted to remember your father." Charles's eyes darted around the workshop, as if checking to see what I had touched. He walked over and placed a cold hand on my shoulder. "You shouldn't come here anymore. Mom, you need to rest. Let us handle these things." I nodded, pretending to be frail. But inside, his words sounded more like a command than a concern. After he left, I stayed for a few more minutes, my heart still pounding. I knew I didn't have much time. They were starting to watch my every move. I stepped out of the workshop into the blinding morning sun. But in my heart, there was only darkness. I had found a crucial piece of the puzzle. Ernest knew, and he had warned me, walking past the junkyard. I stopped and looked up at the sky. A strong gust of wind blew dust into my face, making my eyes sting. I wiped away the tears and whispered to myself, "I understand, Ernest. I will find the truth, even if I have to fight the whole world." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, one hand clutching the small notebook hidden under my pillow, the other holding my phone. I hoped for another message, for any kind of guidance, even just a few words. And then, just as the clock ticked past 2, the screen lit up. "Check the bank accounts. Someone is forging." I sat up, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. The message was both a warning and a command. I knew I had no other choice. The next morning, I put on a thick coat, wrapped a scarf around my neck, and quietly walked to the bank. I chose a time with few customers, my hand gripping my purse as if it could shield me from prying eyes. The teller was a polite, middle-aged man. I handed him my ID and card, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd like to review the recent transactions on my husband's account." He typed a few things, and the screen in front of him lit up. I stared at the numbers. Multiple large withdrawals had been made in recent months. I knew Ernest would never spend money like that. I swallowed hard and asked to see the scanned signatures. When he handed me the printout, my heart sank. It was Ernest's name, but the handwriting was shaky and slanted, not his at all. I had lived with him for so many years. I knew his every pen stroke. His familiar E was always firm and straight. Here, it was distorted and unnaturally elongated. I looked up and asked softly, "Was he alone?" The teller hesitated, glanced around, and then lowered his voice. "No. I remember one time he came in with a young man. I think it was his son. The young man held the papers, and Mr. Hayes just signed." I stood there, frozen. Every word was like a hammer blow to my head. I forced a smile, thanked him, and walked quickly out of the bank. As the glass door closed behind me, I felt my strength drain away. I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to keep from collapsing. Outside, the street was bustling with people and the sound of car horns, but to me, everything seemed faded and distant. In my mind, one question echoed. Why? I dragged myself home, each step heavier than the last. In my coat pocket, Ernest's small notebook rubbed against me, a constant reminder. He had seen it. He had warned me. That afternoon, sitting in the kitchen, I looked at the two photos on the wall, Charles and Henry as children. One was grinning, his face smeared with birthday cake. The other was hugging a puppy, his eyes sparkling. What had those innocent faces become? The hands that once wrapped around my neck were now forging signatures and stealing money behind my back? I trembled, tears falling onto the table. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were fitting together. So clearly it was undeniable. That evening, Charles came over. He said he needed to check a few things and asked for the key to Ernest's office. I tried to sound casual. "I don't know where I put it." He frowned, giving me a long, unsettling look before leaving, his eyes scanning the room suspiciously. After he was gone, I clenched my fists. I knew I had to be more careful. They were watching me. Late that night, sitting alone in the living room, I received another message. This time, just 3 words. "Don't get caught." I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine. The sender knew what I was doing, knew I was searching. I didn't know who they were. But one thing was certain. They were watching me. Every step of the way. I turned off the lights and sat in the darkness. Outside, the wind blew hard, making the tree branches tap against the window pane. In the eerie silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, and for the first time in my life, I was afraid of the children I had brought into this world. Charles arrived on a Saturday morning, as unexpected as a cold wind blowing through an open window. He didn't knock, just turned his key in the lock and walked in as if the house was no longer mine. I was making tea, the scent of mint filling the quiet kitchen. Charles sat down and tapped the table commandingly. "Mom, we need to have a serious talk." I set the teapot down, keeping my voice even. "About what?" His eyes were sharp as a knife. "This house needs to be sold. It's too big, too old. You can't manage it alone. Henry and I have already discussed it. We'll sell it and move you into a good care facility. It's safe, convenient, and you won't have to worry about a thing." I looked straight at him. The face of my son, the little boy who once cried in my arms after falling off his bike, was now cold, the lines around his eyes etched with calculation. I forced a smile. "I'm not ready to leave. I can take care of myself here." Charles pushed his chair back and stood up, his voice tight. "Don't be stubborn. This isn't a suggestion. It's the solution. You have to understand. You're not young anymore." I gripped the edge of the table to keep my hands from shaking. In his eyes, I was no longer a mother, just a problem to be solved. That afternoon, Henry came by. He brought a stack of papers and slammed them on the kitchen table. "Take a look. Mom, this is the brochure for a nursing home in the suburbs. It's a nice place. With professional staff, you'll be taken care of. No more struggling." I flipped through a few pages. Glossy color photos showed sterile white bedrooms, long, cold hallways, and elderly faces sitting motionless in wheelchairs. I swallowed a lump in my throat and pushed the folder back. "I don't need this." Henry gave a humorless smile, his eyes colder than Charles's. "Do you think you have a choice? Dad is gone. We have to take care of you, and this is the only way." I looked up at my 2 sons standing before me. They were nothing like the children I had raised. I heard my own voice, hoarse and strained. "Are you taking care of me or yourselves?" For a brief moment, they both froze. Then Charles let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do you really think we're trying to hurt you? You're being paranoid." I didn't answer. I just sat there, my expression calm to hide the storm raging inside me. They left, leaving the heavy scent of their cologne lingering in the house. I stood alone in the kitchen as the afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows on the floor. I felt as if I was being pushed out of my own home. Little by little. That evening, I got a call. It was Henry, his voice unusually soft. "Mom, I know you're not ready, but please think about it. This is for your own safety." I listened, but said nothing. I knew the truth. Those sweet words didn't come from love. They were a mask for a much larger scheme. After hanging up, I stood by the window, looking out at the garden. The chrysanthemums Ernest had planted were still in bloom, defying the early winter chill. I whispered to myself, "I will not give up this house. I will not let them take everything." I started to make a plan. I would pretend to be weak, to go along with them, to make them think I had given up. But inside, I knew I had to be prepared. I had to be one step ahead. That night, as I wrote down every event, I could hear the clock ticking, each second a reminder. Time was running out, and I didn't have much left. I received the message on a gloomy afternoon as rain drizzled outside. "Meet me. Coffee shop on Main Street, 7 p.m. Come alone." I stared at the screen, 100 questions swirling in my mind. Someone was watching me, knew my every move, my every thought. I had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, my whole body trembled. Should I trust them? Or was this another trap? At exactly 7 o'clock, I arrived at the small coffee shop tucked away on a corner street. The glass windows were fogged with condensation, and only a few customers were inside. The warm yellow light cast a soft glow on the wooden floor, and the rich aroma of roasted coffee filled the air. I walked in, my heart pounding like a drum. A middle-aged man sat in a corner booth, so ordinary that he was almost invisible. He wore a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled down low, but his eyes were sharp as he watched me approach. He nodded. I sat down, trying to remain calm. He placed his phone on the table and slid it toward me. The screen lit up. It was the same messages I had received. "I'm the one who sent them," he said, his voice low and steady. "My name is Miller. I'm a private investigator. Your husband hired me before he died." The room seemed to spin. I gripped the edge of the table. "You're saying Ernest hired you?" Miller nodded. He suspected his sons. Said they were obsessed with his insurance policy, pressuring him to sign papers. He was worried about you. He asked me to keep an eye on things. My vision blurred. Ernest. He knew. He had sensed the danger, and he had found a way to protect me, even when he knew his own time was running out. Miller took an envelope from his pocket and placed it on the table. "This is what I've gathered." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of Charles meeting a strange man in a parking lot, exchanging an envelope, Henry coming out of the bank, clutching a folder, his eyes darting around nervously. There was also a transcript of a recording, Charles's voice, low and urgent. "The old man is easy to persuade, and if he doesn't sign, we have other ways." I gasped. The air knocked out of me. This was no longer just a suspicion. This was the cold, hard truth. Miller looked at me, his expression serious. "I know this is hard to believe, but you need to be prepared. Your husband's death. It wasn't an accident." I clutched the envelope, my hands ice cold. A part of me had already known, but hearing him say it out loud still felt like being struck by lightning. "Then why?" I hesitated, my voice hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" "I had to make sure you were safe," Miller replied. "If they found out, you would have been next." I sat in silence, my heart pounding painfully. In my mind, I saw Charles and Henry, not as the children I had raised, but as strangers with dark eyes and blood on their hands. Miller continued, his tone firm. "I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me. From now on, don't give them any reason to be suspicious. Let them think you're weak, that you've given up. In the meantime, we'll gather enough evidence." I nodded, swallowing my tears. "I just want justice for Ernest. I can't let him die in vain." He looked me straight in the eye. "And we need to protect you, because they've already started talking about getting you out of the way." His words echoed in my head all the way home. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. I sat in the dark room, still clutching the envelope, listening to the rain tap against the roof. Outside, the city was quiet, but inside me, a quiet determination was catching fire. I would not let Ernest die for nothing. I would not let them bury the truth. I'll never forget the moment Miller pressed play. The sound buzzed in my ears, muffled at first, then chillingly clear. First came Charles's voice, deep and calm, as if discussing a business deal. Then Henry's, cold as ice. They talked about the plan, about making it look natural, about a worst-case scenario, and about who would handle the paperwork. I sat frozen. Every word they spoke was like a claw digging into my heart. These weren't jokes or casual remarks. This was a calculated, meticulously planned conversation. They discussed scenarios to deceive medical examiners, to make his death look like an accident or illness. They mentioned money, how much, who got what, and how to handle me if I started asking too many questions. I felt like I had been ripped from the earth. Every warm memory of my children vanished, replaced by the faces they wore now, cold, calculating, and cruel. I remembered the sleepless nights I'd spent nursing them when they were sick, the times Ernest and I sold old furniture to pay for their medicine, the mornings I woke up early to sew and earn a little extra. It all played back in slow motion, with their heartless words as the soundtrack. If Mom becomes a problem, it will have to look convincing. I heard my voice, hoarse and weak. How could they say that? But the words were just a faint echo in the room. Miller lowered his voice. "Don't react. They want you to be weak, to be off your guard. We have to be strategic." Rage surged through me, but it was tangled with a profound, indescribable pain. I thought of Ernest. He had suspected, he had been afraid, he had tried to warn me. He hadn't faced the storm alone. He had prepared for the worst. So I had to do what he would have wanted, expose the truth and save my own life. Miller and I began to piece everything together. The evidence wasn't just a few photos or a single recording. It was a pattern of behavior, the money withdrawals, the drafted contracts to sell the house, the mysterious appearances of a broker, the meeting in the parking lot, the coded conversations about arrangements, and the appointments Ernest had avoided telling me about. When we laid it all out, a complete picture emerged. Not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated plot. But Miller warned me. They can deny it. They can put on a show. They'll try to have you declared incompetent to take away your legal rights. They'll use doctor's notes, forged documents, and even public sympathy. This is going to be a long fight. His voice was so serious that my whole body trembled, not from fear, but in preparation for battle. The truth forced me to accept an unavoidable reality. I couldn't fight this alone. I had once believed I could, but the legal system, with its notarized documents and investigations, all of it required help. Miller introduced me to an older lawyer in the next town who specialized in estate disputes and family exploitation cases. I met her on a rainy afternoon, and for the first time in weeks, I heard a determined edge in my own voice. We're going to do whatever it takes. Our plan wasn't a loud confrontation or walking into a trap. Miller told me I had to do two things at once. First, maintain the appearance of being frail so they wouldn't get suspicious too soon. Second, quietly gather more evidence, photocopying mail, making secret recordings, getting bank statements, and finding witnesses who could confirm Charles or Henry's involvement in the paperwork. He also advised me not to confront my sons directly, because that's when emotion overtakes reason, and one slip of the tongue could make them cover their tracks. Many people might think I was terrified hearing all this, but in truth, a strange strength was rising within me. I thought of Ernest, of our youth spent hunched over his small workshop, of the evenings we sat together, figuring out how to make ends meet. I thought, if my children could become murderers for money, then I could turn my helplessness into the strength needed to bring the truth to light. We started to organize the evidence. Miller gave me a to-do list, step by step, but without revealing any details that could be construed as illegal, a line a good detective knows not to cross. My job was to collect proof of motive and action, the phone calls, the meetings, the unusual financial transactions. The lawyer drafted letters to the bank and other relevant parties, requesting a temporary freeze on certain accounts and the preservation of all records. The hardest part for me was pretending to be defeated. Whenever Charles or Henry visited, I forced myself to seem tired, forgetful, and depressed. I let them think their mother was broken by grief. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and I knew they were calculating. It was a horrifying feeling, having to play a role I despised to save my own life. Besides the secret meetings with Miller and the lawyer, I reached out to a few neighbors, people who had known our family for years. Doris, as always, was by my side. She quietly helped with chores, greeted visitors when needed, and even baked pies for me to take to church, a strategy to show everyone I was still normal. Doris also agreed to be a witness for me, ready to testify about Charles and Henry's strange behavior. That small show of support felt like a shield. At night, I would sit by the window, looking out at the yard where Ernest used to rake leaves. Darkness was before me, but inside, a steady light was burning. I had lost my beloved husband, but I hadn't lost my courage. I made a promise to myself, to Ernest, and to justice that I would not give up. I would fight to prove the truth, to bring justice for the man I loved, and to protect what was left of my life. And as I checked off each item on my to-do list, my heart no longer trembled with fear. It beat strong and steady, like the rhythm of someone preparing to enter a battle they believed they could win. Miller and my lawyer, Helen, became the arms I no longer had, pulling me out of the abyss of loneliness and fear. The task at hand wasn't about shouting from the rooftops. It was about carefully assembling each piece, statements, photos, journals, recordings, into a frame that would convince the authorities. Every piece of paper on the table held the weight of my life, and I knew that one wrong move could make the whole effort collapse. Helen, a woman with a heart of steel and a warm voice, started by coaching me on how to maintain my outward appearance. Appear weak when you need to. Don't argue with your sons in front of anyone. It's your home. But right now, you have to play the victim to protect yourself. I felt a lump in my throat, having to act to survive, how cruel life could be. But she explained that in the eyes of the public and the court, emotional outbursts could derail an investigation. We needed to be cold, strategic, not just emotional. Helen prepared a file of evidence to submit to the police station and the district attorney's office. Miller and I went over each recording, pointing out the sections that could be used as evidence. He warned me not to reveal the source of the tapes to anyone outside our trusted circle. If the information leaked, my sons could bribe or threaten witnesses or even destroy evidence. We went to see Lieutenant O'Donnell at the police department. I stood quietly behind my lawyer as she presented our case. The lieutenant looked tired, but his eyes were focused. When Helen opened the envelope, laying out the bank statements with forged signatures, the suspicious photos, and the audio transcripts, He listened intently and took notes. He said he would forward everything to the DA's office to decide whether to open a criminal case. I felt my heart tighten. This was real action. Not long after, a representative from the district attorney's office called me. They wanted to review the documents and schedule a preliminary meeting. This was a good sign. Once the DA was involved, it was no longer just speculation. I stayed calm during the meeting, answering their questions truthfully, providing dates, times, and names of witnesses. Miller handled the technical evidence. I knew my son's lawyers would be formidable, but at least the prosecution now had enough reason to re-examine the cause of death. Meanwhile, my sons didn't sit idle. They counterattacked in a way I hadn't anticipated. They filed a petition for guardianship, claiming I was disoriented from grief. The first legal notice made my blood run cold. They were arguing that I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs and requested an emergency hearing to protect my interests. They moved so quickly, I realized this was an age-old tactic to strip someone of their rights, and they knew exactly what they were doing. My lawyer responded immediately. They'll use doctors' signatures, false witnesses, even bribe someone to say you're forgetful or confused. Don't give them any ammunition. She instructed me on how to handle it. Don't answer calls from unknown numbers. Only meet with relatives when a witness is present, and record any interactions possible. She filed a motion to dismiss the guardianship petition, requesting a temporary hold on all assets and barring my sons from making any transactions related to the house or my accounts until a ruling was made. During this time, Miller worked quietly in the background. He gathered more evidence of cash transactions, contacted a bank employee willing to testify, and searched for security footage from the parking lot where Charles was photographed buying a strange substance, a key piece of evidence Miller had hinted at before. He even tried to contact the seller, the man who took cash from Charles, to get a statement. Every time Miller reported a new lead, I felt another brick being laid in my wall of defense. But my son's attacks didn't stop with the guardianship petition. They started a media campaign, trying to portray me as a grieving mother who needed to be protected. Letters of support, feigned calls of concern, all of it was designed to create social pressure and discredit me in the eyes of my neighbors and the judge. Helen proactively sent a brief statement to the press, emphasizing that the matter was under investigation and requesting respect for the legal process. The stress was immense. I had to play the part of a frail old woman whenever Charles or Henry appeared, pretending to be confused to keep them off guard. Inside, I was preparing for a prolonged legal battle. Helen arranged for a handwriting expert, a voice analyst, and a forensic pathologist to review the cause of death if necessary. We filed requests for medical records and an additional autopsy. Miller contacted a chemist to test for the presence of toxins in the deceased's tissue samples. If found, it would be clear evidence of murder. Every step required caution. I had to remain calm in front of everyone, but every night, behind closed doors, I cried until I had no tears left. The pain of betrayal was a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. But now, that pain had transformed into determination. I wasn't just fighting for Ernest anymore. I was fighting to avoid becoming the next victim and to reclaim the honor of what we had built together. The date for the guardianship hearing approached. My heart felt like a clenched fist, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not alone. Miller, Helen, Doris, and a few loyal neighbors would be by my side. We were prepared. I turned off the light, looked up at the strange, starry sky, and whispered, "If the law is the path, then I will walk it to the end. No matter how tired I am, no matter how weak I have to pretend to be, I will not give up." I was awake all night before the hearing, like a sentry guarding a house in the path of a storm. It wasn't because I was afraid of the courtroom, but because every image, every sound, and every memory was rising up at once, as if a lifetime of memories was being forged into strength. In the brightly lit kitchen, I sat with my back to the wooden table where Ernest used to drink his coffee, my hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. Outside the window, the streets were quiet, and the yellow streetlights reflected off the lingering raindrops on the glass. I stared at the strange patterns in my tea and thought about the days we were both covered in grease, laughing over a burnt piece of toast. Those simple memories now tasted as bitter as lemon juice. Doris arrived early. She stood on the porch, holding a plate of freshly made toast, and her expression faltered as if she could smell the anxiety in the air. "Maggie," she said softly, "did you get any sleep?" I shook my head. She sighed, walked in, set the plate down, and sat across from me. The silence between two old friends stretched for a long minute, as if counting each heartbeat. "I told Miller to call me at dawn," Doris began. "He said the file has been submitted to the prosecutor's office. They're reviewing it." My hand tightened around the cup. A flicker of hope ignited, but it was as fragile as a candle in the wind. "But they'll be ruthless," I replied. "Charles and Henry won't stay quiet. They've filed for guardianship. They'll try to paint me as insane." My voice caught, not because I was unprepared, but because the realization of their betrayal cut to the bone. Doris took my hand, her grip firm, as if trying to transfer some of her strength to me. "Listen, Maggie. For all the years we lived next to Ernest, people knew what a good man he was. Tomorrow, you just have to tell the truth. Just be honest. People will listen." She spoke with certainty, not with empty reassurances. After a morning meeting with my lawyer, Helen, my to-do list was clear. Get to the courthouse early, dress formally but simply, and bring all the notarized documents, bank statements, audio recordings, a copy of Ernest's notebook, and Doris's witness statement. The lawyer carefully instructed me on how to answer questions, speak slowly, clearly, without letting emotion overwhelm my voice, and above all, do not engage in personal arguments with my sons. "They will try to make you lose your composure," Helen warned. "That's when they'll win in the court of public opinion. Hold steady, Margaret. We have the evidence." As Helen was leaving, she leaned in, placed a hand on my shoulder, her voice both gentle and firm. "Tomorrow, you are not just fighting for justice for Ernest. You are fighting for the rest of your life. Remember, you fought your whole life. Don't let them take that away from you." I wanted to cry, but instead, I let out a long sigh, as if releasing all my energy to prepare for a new, stronger breath. In the afternoon, Miller stopped by. He brought a small USB drive and a chart of recent transactions. He sat beside me, his voice serious. "We've managed to temporarily freeze a few accounts. I've also found a witness who is willing to testify about the time Charles withdrew a large amount of cash." His face looked tired, but his eyes were bright. "The most important thing is that you stick to the script. Let me handle the technical parts." I listened, memorizing every detail. Each clue Miller brought was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. But waves of grief still washed over me. The nights Ernest told me he was worried, the times he whispered, "If anything happens, you have to stay strong." He had given me that responsibility. I couldn't back down now. In the evening, I baked Ernest's favorite apple pie, not to eat, but to keep a routine, to have a familiar action my heart could hold on to. I wrapped the pie, placed it on the counter, and looked at his empty chair as if making a promise. This wasn't a ritual of mourning, but a commitment. I would hold on to our habits, our memories, and my promise to him. As night fell, I practiced the words I would say in court. I repeated them over and over. My name is Margaret Hayes. I lived with Ernest for 42 years. I know my husband's signature. I know how our money was managed. I know how my sons used to look at their family. I spoke slowly, letting the sound fill the room, letting my mind memorize the words. This wasn't a speech. It was a bridge between memory and duty. Fear never left me. At times, I imagined Henry standing up and shouting that I was crazy. I saw Charles presenting forged documents. I saw the judgment of society turning against me. I felt small, but my fear for myself was less than my fear of what would happen if the truth was buried. Before I slept, if you could call it sleep, I placed my hand on a photo of a young Ernest. I whispered, as if in prayer, "My love, I will do my best. I will speak loudly so everyone can hear. If I'm scared, remind me of what you told me. If I'm weak, send me your strength." And in the darkness, I felt a faint warmth, as if an invisible hand was resting on my shoulder. The next morning, I woke up with an unusual resolve, not excitement, but a calm that follows a great storm. I wore a simple black dress, combed my hair carefully, and chose a small scarf Ernest had once given me. Before leaving, Doris squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes red. "Maggie, you will do great. No matter what happens, we did the right thing." I left the house, got into the car, and took one last look at the garden where Ernest used to rake leaves. On the way to the courthouse, I focused on my breathing. 1, 2, 3. Slow and deep. My heart was still pounding, but now it was beating for a reason stronger than pain, for justice, for memory, and for my own freedom. The hearing was about to begin. I was ready to stand up, to tell the truth to the world, to the judge, and to the very people who were once my flesh and blood. I walked into the courtroom not as a helpless victim, but as a mother who had survived a silent war, ready to fight until my voice was heard. The courtroom was packed. Television cameras lined the hallway, and reporters crowded the entrance, snapping photos. I moved through it all as if in a fog, the flashing lights, the whispers, the curious stares. Everything was focused on one thing, my family's story, Ernest's death, and the 2 sons I once trusted. Each step felt heavier than the last, like walking on wet stone. When I took my seat on the witness stand, the eyes of the courtroom flickered like candles. Across the room, Charles and Henry sat together, dressed in pale gray prison jumpsuits. Their expressions were cold, and they occasionally glanced at me as if I were a piece of scrap paper. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking, but something inside me had hardened. I had to speak every word clearly until there was nothing left to hide. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a slow, steady voice, began by painting the whole picture. He spoke of our simple life, of the unusual withdrawals, of the secret meetings captured on camera. He laid out each piece of evidence like bricks, bank statements, photos, recordings. As each item was displayed on a large screen, the courtroom fell silent, as if everyone was holding their breath to hear the truth from these inanimate objects. When the first recording was played, Charles's voice was unmistakable. The words were ice cold, the plan discussed with casual cruelty. How to make it look like an accident. Increase the insurance and then split it. If Mom gets suspicious, we'll deal with it later. I felt my stomach clench. Every word landed like a sharp knife. I wanted to jump up and scream, "That is my son!" But I had been instructed, stay calm, tell the truth, and let the prosecutor do the rest. The prosecutor played one piece of evidence after another. Calls to the bank, photos of Charles receiving an envelope, footage of Henry rummaging through papers. Each piece was presented to demonstrate a series of premeditated actions driven by a clear motive, debt, greed, and a cold calculation where money was at the center. When it was my turn to testify, my heart felt like it would break. I looked at the judge, at the jury, searching for a single face without hatred, just one sympathetic glance. I took a deep breath and began. My name is Margaret Hayes. I lived with Ernest for 42 years. I know my husband's handwriting. I know he was careful and cautious. I know he would never sign a major contract without understanding it completely. I know the sound of his voice when he was happy, when he was angry, and when he was worried. My voice was hoarse, but I made sure every word was clear. I read the lines from his notebook, the shaky handwriting revealing the fear he had tried to hide. I talked about the evenings he would sit quietly, about the time he came home exhausted, saying that something wasn't right. The prosecutor guided me through the documents we had collected. "Do you recognize this signature?" I looked at it and confirmed. That is Ernest's signature, but it's different. It looks forced. When he showed the photos of the secret meetings, I had to grip the edge of the stand to keep from sobbing. I told them about the times I saw Charles and Henry being secretive, about the contract to sell the house I found under the sofa cushion, about the money transfers I knew nothing about. The moment I recounted, overhearing Charles whisper, "What if Mom finds out?" The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Henry turned his head away, his eyes red, but not with remorse, only fear, like someone caught in the act. I heard someone in the audience gasp. That's when I knew. My words had weight. Every fragile detail had become a strategic weapon. In the jury box, an elderly woman wiped away a tear. I didn't know who she was, but I saw the empathy on her face, and it felt like a wave of warmth washing over me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and continued. I didn't hide anything, didn't embellish. I spoke of love, of how Ernest had tried to protect me by hiring an investigator, of how he had left warnings in his notebook. I spoke of the feeling of betrayal, but I didn't let the pain control my words. I spoke clearly for the law to hear. During the defense's turn, Charles and Henry's lawyer tried everything. He argued that the recordings could have been edited, that the signatures could have been forged, that the photos were just misunderstood moments. They tried to paint a picture of a family with normal disagreements, not a murder conspiracy. They tried to sow doubt, but the prosecutor countered with voice experts, handwriting analysts, and testimony from witnesses. Each of their denials grew weaker against the chain of interconnected evidence. The trial lasted all day, with fierce arguments from both sides. When the tension reached its peak, the jury retreated to deliberate. I sat there, my heart pounding. Everything in my mind suddenly shrank. Ernest, the flower garden, the wooden table, the sound of his laughter. I squeezed Doris's hand. She squeezed back protectively and whispered, "He's with you now, don't worry." When the jury returned, the judge read the verdict summary aloud. Both defendants were found guilty in connection with the death and insurance fraud, with aggravating circumstances indicating a severe crime. In that moment, a small clap of thunder went off in my heart, not of victory, but of acknowledgement that justice had been served for the man I loved. Charles buried his face in his hands. Henry collapsed. I didn't jump for joy. I just felt a cold, quiet peace wash over me, like a breeze through an open window after a long storm. Someone came to hug me. Doris sobbed on my shoulder. Miller looked at me, his eyes holding a look of validation. "Ernest has been vindicated." I walked out of the courtroom into the sunlight, but this time, instead of blinding me, it showed me the way forward. I had won, not for revenge, but to reclaim honor and to let the truth be heard. When I stepped into the workshop for the first time in weeks, the place that held so many memories, I placed my hand on a piece of wood Ernest had once sanded, smooth, In the silence, I whispered, "I did it. You can rest now." I knew the journey ahead was still long, the legal aftermath, facing public opinion, wounds that would never fully heal. But today, justice had stirred and spoken, and for me, that was the beginning of a rebirth. I came home late that evening, the echoes of the trial still ringing in my mind. The dim yellow light from the porch lamp cast a soft glow on the damp steps, and the old wooden door creaked like a sigh as I opened it. The familiar house suddenly felt larger, emptier, but it was no longer heavy with the shadow of fear. For the first time in months, I walked into my kitchen without looking over my shoulder. Doris had already set out a tray of pastries and a steaming pot of tea. She sat there, her hands folded, her eyes warm. I sat down and picked up a cup. The scent of mint filled the air, reminding me that I was still alive, still feeling, still entitled to peace. "You did something incredible." "Maggie," Doris said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not everyone has the courage to stand up like that." I looked at her, then down at my own hands. They were calloused from years of work, but these were the same hands that had written my testimony, clutched every piece of evidence, and held on to the truth without letting go. I replied softly, "I had no choice. If I had stayed silent, Ernest would never have rested in peace, and I wouldn't have been myself anymore." After that night, a new chapter began. No more anonymous, threatening calls, no more strange keys turning in the lock. The house was no longer a battlefield, it was my sanctuary again. But that peace didn't come easily. I had to relearn how to breathe, how to sleep without waking in a panic, how to trust the silence. One day, I took a walk in the garden. The chrysanthemums Ernest had planted were fading, but I didn't cut them down. I let them wither naturally, as if letting time close a season. I touched each stem, remembering his hands tending the soil, remembering him saying, "These flowers are resilient, just like us." I smiled through my tears, realizing I was just like them, trampled but still standing. I also started to write. Every morning, I would sit by the window with a new notebook and jot down my thoughts. Not for anyone else to read, but to remind myself I had walked through the fire, I had risen, and I was moving forward. I wrote about Ernest, about love, about betrayal, and about a strength I never knew I possessed. The blank pages slowly filled with words, and within them, I could almost see my husband's encouraging smile. Miller still visited from time to time. He was no longer a mysterious figure in the shadows, but a true friend. He told me about other cases, about other families who had endured unimaginable losses. "But you know," he said, "strong people like you are the reason I keep doing this work. Because justice can only survive if someone dares to speak up for it." I thanked him, not with words, but with a look of gratitude. Helen, my steel-willed lawyer, also called me regularly after the trial. She helped me prepare for the post-verdict legal procedures, property deeds, insurance claims, and the division of the remaining inheritance. She told me, "Now you have a chance to start over. Keep the house. Keep your freedom. Don't let anyone make decisions for you ever again." I nodded, understanding that the hard part wasn't over. But this time, I was walking forward with a different mindset. Sometimes I would sit in church, the flickering candlelight illuminating the wooden statues. I would close my eyes and let my heart ache. I didn't pray for miracles, but I would whisper, "Please give me the strength to love again." I knew forgiveness was a long journey. Forgiving the children I had brought into this world but who had lost their way. Forgiving myself for not seeing the signs sooner, for letting Ernest face his fears alone. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness was my way of not being imprisoned by hatred. One morning, I decided to open the old workshop. The room was silent, covered in a thick layer of dust, but as the light streamed in, I saw the familiar wooden stool, the workbench with its familiar scratches. I sat down on the stool, closed my eyes, and heard the echo of a hammer in my memory. I placed my hand on the bench and whispered, "Ernest, I'm still here. I will protect our home, our memories, and myself." As I stepped out of the workshop, I saw Doris standing by the door, holding a small potted plant. "Brought this for you," she said, "to replant in the garden. Life needs to start again." I held the pot to my chest, a new sense of hope welling up inside me. From the ashes, life could still grow. Rebuilding my life wasn't about forgetting. It was about rearranging the pieces. I learned to smile at my neighbors, to accept invitations to community events, to receive their kind words without feeling afraid. I slowly began to believe that I wasn't just a betrayed mother, but a woman who had walked through darkness to find the light. Every night before I sleep, I close my eyes and say softly, "Thank you, Ernest. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for leaving me your strength." And I know that somewhere, he hears me. On a rare, clear morning, I sat on the rocking chair on my porch, watching the golden sunlight spill across the dew-kissed lawn. The silence was so profound I could hear the sparrows chirping on the roof, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the soft clink of a spoon against my teacup. It was all familiar, simple, yet for me, it held a new meaning. I had returned to the place that was once a prison of fear and made it my own sanctuary. My mind was no longer haunted by threats or the imagined sound of a staged accident. Instead, there was peace, as if the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief with me. The old walls were no longer witnesses to lies, but a place to hang the family photos I chose to keep. Ernest holding me on a trip to the coast, me smiling in a floral dress, and a picture of me and Doris under the old oak tree. These photos didn't erase the darkness, but they reminded me that light had existed and still did. I began to teach myself how to love again. Each day, I allowed myself one small joy, trying a new kind of tea, rereading an old book, or writing a few lines in my journal. I also opened my home to neighbors more often, not for their pity, but to share, to laugh, and to remember that human connection is what keeps us standing. Once, Doris looked at me, smiled, and said, "You know, Maggie, I've never seen you so strong." I smiled back, but in my heart, I knew this strength hadn't come from nowhere. It was forged in the fire of pain, betrayal, tears, and even blood. It was the inheritance Ernest had left me, not property or money, but resilience. I realized something profound. True love cannot be bought. Ernest had left me the most valuable inheritance of all, a simple life, an honest heart, and the belief that justice can triumph over deceit. In contrast, the children I bore, blinded by greed, had lost themselves. Money could buy contracts, lawyers, and even lies, but it could never buy peace of mind. The day I planted the sapling Doris gave me, I knelt in the garden, turning the soil, and thought to myself, this is a beginning. I don't know how many years I have left, but I know I will live each remaining day fully for myself, free from anyone's control. I will protect my inner freedom like a fragile but brilliant flame. Sometimes, as I write these words, I ask myself, why am I telling you all of this? Because I believe that somewhere out there, Someone else is trapped in the darkness of a toxic family, of deceit, of emotional abuse. I want you to hear my story and know that you are not alone. You have the right to stand up, the right to seek justice, and the right to love yourself even if the world is against you. I lost a great deal. I lost Ernest. I lost the beautiful image of my children, and I lost a peaceful old age. But I also found something more important: truth, justice, and courage. And through them, I won my freedom. Freedom isn't living in a big house or having a full bank account. Freedom is being able to breathe without fear, to sleep without nightmares, and to walk without bowing your head. Freedom is when you can look in the mirror and see an honest person, unbound by lies or the control of others. If you have listened to my story this far, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening to the story of an old woman who nearly lost everything. Thank you for giving your time and your heart to understand and to share in this journey. Your presence, as a listener, as a sympathizer, is proof that truth is still valued. I know that not everyone can stand up alone, but I also know that when we dare to speak, when we dare to seek help, there will always be someone who will reach out and take our hand. I had Doris, Miller, Helen, and people like you, people who are willing to listen. If this story has touched you, please continue to support this channel. Share it with those who need to hear it, and let more people know that true love can never be bought or sold, and that inner freedom is the greatest victory of a lifetime. I close this story not with a period, but with an ellipsis, because my journey of living continues. And I hope that when you look at your own life, you too will find the strength to write the next chapter of your story. Thank you, and I hope to see you in the next story.